Hi everyone, Professor Rojo here. What we're going to do on Wednesday, if you're in the 101, 102 sections, is discuss when this electrical conduction system, so this SA node, AV node, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, all that stuff, when it misbehaves, and how to figure out what's going wrong based off of the ECG. And so we kind of know that we should always have a process where the SA node fires first because it fires the fastest. That signal should spread down through the atria, get conducted to the AV node, and then spread down through the ventricles, and it should always maintain that order. So to kind of introduce what happens when things go wrong, I just wanted to use a stupid analogy that will help us as we look at more complicated ECGs. So the way I think about it is that the SA node is kind of our leader, our general. It is called the pacemaker for a reason. Its job is to set the pace of the heart rhythm, set the pace for action potentials. But what we know about all the other cells in this conduction system, so for example, the AV node, is that they too can fire their own action potentials. They too could be boss if they wanted to, but they always listen to the SA node, to the general. So all of these cells throughout the Purkinje fibers, the bundle branches, their job is to fire action potentials, but always listen to the general. So this one fires action potentials, causes this one to, then this one, then this one, then this one. Everybody should be paying attention to the leader. And if they do, we always get a signal that starts in the SA node and spreads through the ventricles. It's always atria first, and it's always ventricles second. If everybody listens to the chain of command and everybody listens to the person before them, we should always get a beautiful, perfect ECG. And this is what we saw last lab when we recorded your own ECG, and most of yours should have looked something like this. This one sets the pace and everybody else follows. But what we're going to see today is two potential things that could go wrong, two very general things that could go wrong that would make our ECG look pretty weird and potentially life-threatening. So one thing that could happen is that the general misbehaves. Our leader, our pacemaker, misbehaves. For example, if the general decides that he or she wants to beat more quickly than they should. So normally the SA node should fire at 60 to 100 beats per minute when at rest. But what if it goes too fast? What if our general goes too slow? Or what if our general is damaged or dead? What are we going to do then? So one general problem that could happen is our SA node or our leader is not behaving properly. Too fast, too slow, or it's just dead or malfunctioning. The second problem, and the one that tends to be much more serious, is when this one is working fine, that we have our leader, he or she's behaving as they should, but what happens is that some soldiers lower in the chain of command decide to misbehave and go rogue. They decide, I'm not listening to the SA node anymore. I'm not listening to the leader. I'm going to do my own thing. So often what happens is that they go outside the chain of command, and sometimes they'll have action potentials much more quickly than they should, and they do that without listening to the general. So these are the very two general features of things that could go wrong. Something's wrong with the general, or sometimes these little soldiers decide to misbehave. And another example we see of soldiers misbehaving is when we have tons of soldiers misbehaving. And so we'll see what happens when we get all these little pockets of cells that decide that they're going to fire their own action potential without listening to the general. All right, so that's my stupid analogy, and we're going to try to use that for the remaining part of this video to figure out what could be going wrong in some weird ECGs. So let's get into them. What we're going to try to do now, is look at different, what are known as heart arrhythmias, where basically the normal rhythm of the heart, the normal sequence in the ECG is abnormal. And we're going to call that an arrhythmia, so the abnormal rhythm. And so if we look at the first class of things that could go wrong, which was our little general misbehaving, so that meant our leader, our pacemaker, is not working properly. That means that the sinoatrial node is doing something wrong. That means that our leader, our SA node, is not behaving properly. So let's first look at what it should look like, again, if the general behaves properly. We should have a normal P wave, QRS, T wave, a segment, and then repeat. So this is what's known as a normal sinus rhythm. Sinus just refers to the sinoatrial node, so our general. So our SA node, or sinus, is working normally. Everything looks normal. The beat is within a normal resting rate of about 60 to 100 beats per minute. Everything's good. General's behaving as they should. But what if the general decides to go too fast? Let's look at what that ECG should look like. If you look at this ECG, everything actually looks pretty normal. You see a P wave, QRS, T, and then you repeat. P, QRS, T. Everything looks clean. Everything is there. Everything's in the right order. But the problem is that the resting heart rate is much higher than normal. The general is going too fast. The orders that he or she is giving are too frequent, too often. In ECG talk, fast rate or rhythm is referred to as tachycardia. And since this is occurring from the general or the SA node, we call this sinus tachycardia. So everything looks really normal. Nothing too serious or potentially life-threatening in the immediate future here. Atria are contracting, ventricles are contracting. It's just going really fast when this person is at rest. Okay, now let's see if our general is going too slow. Everything looks normal again, P wave, QRS, T, but now you'll notice that I have very infrequent heart rhythms. In ECG talk, slow heart rate or slow rhythm is called bradycardia. Since this is occurring from the sinoatrial node, from the general, we call this sinus bradycardia. So everything looks normal. The general is still in control, but the heart rate is much slower than normal. Atria look normal, ventricles look normal, everything looks normal, but there are just not enough heartbeats per minute compared to what should normally be happening. All right, so these are two examples of the general going too fast, general going too slow. Now what we're going to do is look into cases where the soldiers, so everybody but the general, is not listening to the general. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So for example, let's say that the general is trying to bark orders and say, contract every 60 times per minute. So fire. He's setting the rhythm. He's trying to set the rhythm as much as possible. But this one decides, actually, no, I'm good. I want to go at 100 beats per minute, or 200 beats per minute, or 75 beats per minute. I don't give a flying hoot what you're saying. I'm going to do it myself. And so what this is known as is what's known as an ectopic pacemaker. Ectopic just means out of place or not where it should be. You might have heard of the term ectopic pregnancy, where the embryo implants in a place where it shouldn't be. So an ectopic pacemaker is someone trying to set the pace, usually faster than what the SA node is. So we kind of have this pacemaker that is not the SA node. So for example, let's say that this little guy here decides, I want to go at 100 beats per minute. I know you're saying to go at 60, but I don't care. I'm going to go at 100. So this little pacemaker here is located in the ventricles. So he's trying to tell the ventricles, don't worry about what the atria are doing. Fire at 100 beats per minute. Let's look at what that ECG looks like. Well, very different than the normal ECG that we've seen. So because we have this pacemaker that is firing very, very fast, we're going to call this tachycardia. Remember, tachycardia just means very high rate. But because this signal is originating in the ventricles, that's where our ectopic pacemaker is, we're going to call this ventricular tachycardia. And what you notice is that this looks very different than our normal ECG. It's really hard to find a P wave. These huge QRS complexes look really weird, and they're occurring very frequently. So one defining feature of ventricular tachycardia is that you see these QRS complexes at a very high rate. These are happening very frequently. And what's also a defining feature of ventricular tachycardia is that these QRS complexes tend to be really fat, really wide. Normally they should be this perfect skinny little spike, but you'll notice that this QRS is starting and it takes forever to end. It's really wide, where normally it should be this clean skinny spike. And the reason it tends to be pretty wide is because this signal is originating outside the normal conduction system. So normally it should start in the AV node and spread quickly down through the fibers. But if it starts in this weird place, it's going to spread through the muscle in a much slower, much more inefficient way. So it's going to take longer for the ventricles to depolarize because it's not spreading through the heart via the normal conduction system. The signal's not designed to start here. So if it does, it's going to take much longer to spread through the ventricles, and you see this very wide QRS complex. So ventricular tachycardia, which is pretty bad, pretty dangerous arrhythmia, is characterized by really frequent QRS, and these QRS tend to look really wide and fat. All right, so what we have here is one little soldier, an ectopic pacemaker, deciding, I'm going to go really fast in the ventricles. So that's one example, VTAC, or ventricular tachycardia. Second example, let's say that there's not just one rogue soldier. Let's say there's not just one ectopic pacemaker, but let's say that there are a bunch. A bunch of these soldiers have decided, you know, we're all actually fed up with the general, with our leader. We're going to do our own thing. This little pocket of autorhythmic cells is going to say, I'm going to go at 100 beats per minute. This one says, I like 103. I'm going to take it even further, 150. I actually am going to slow it down to 60. I'm going at 101. So this is pretty bad. Where not only do we have an ectopic pacemaker, but we have many. And they're all firing at their own rhythm. And that's pretty bad because we know what the heart needs to do is to beat in a very coordinated and at the same rhythm. But if everybody's telling the atria, for example, to contract and beat at different times, what ends up happening is that the atria just go through this huge uncoordinated excitation. Like if you look here, where's the P wave? Is that it? Is that it? It's just a bunch of noise. Because the atria are getting stimulated by a bunch of different cells at different times. And so one defining feature of having a bunch of ectopic pacemakers is that you lose the coordination. And anytime you see this word right here, fibrillation, you should think no coordination. So atrial fibrillation means that there is no coordination of the signal spreading through the atria. There's no coordination in the atria. There's no coordination in the signal. So you can't see a P wave. You just see a bunch of noise. And the reason this will be so bad, especially when we get to the ventricles, is that if the atria are being excited in a very uncoordinated way, they actually won't contract in a coordinated way. But what we saw last lab is that it is absolutely critical for the muscle in the heart to contract in a very specific way. So if they get excited by a bunch of different cells at different times, the atria will actually just quiver in place and they won't contract productively, which means that they won't pump blood. Effectively, your atria are ineffective. They might as well be dead to you because they're not pumping blood effectively. All right, so we have a bunch of pacemakers in the atria, uncoordinated. Atria are uncoordinated or fibrillating. So now let's put all those pacemakers in the ventricles and see what that would look like. So if we have a bunch of ectopic pacemakers uncoordinated in the ventricles, we know that anytime we see that word uncoordinated, we should think fibrillation. And so let's look at what ventricular fibrillation looks like. Like if somebody were to ask you, where's the P wave? Where's the QRS? Where's the T? You would probably say, It just looks like mess. It actually looks a lot like an EMG. Remember when we got your skeletal muscle electrical activity and we just saw a bunch of up and down squigglies uncoordinated? Anytime you look at an ECG and it just looks like noise and you don't see any kind of rhythm, you can't identify any kind of wave, that's usually always ventricular fibrillation. Because the ventricles are so big that they produce such a strong signal that if they're doing something uncoordinated, they dominate and hide everything. And we just see a bunch of noise from all these cells talking at the same time and at different times. So the ventricles are not coordinated, so it's hard to find a QRS complex. Like where does it start, where does it end? Just a bunch of noise. And anytime you have fibrillation, we know what that means is that the muscle will quiver and not contract productively. So let's look at what that looks like in the ventricles. Oops. So if we look at this ECG right here and someone were to ask you, where is the P wave, where is the QRS, where is the T? If your answer is, it's probably ventricular fibrillation. The ventricles are being excited at different times, all at the same time, and it's just uncoordinated, and you just see noise from an uncoordinated signal. That's VFib, or ventricular fibrillation. And this video is actually going to show what the ventricles look like when they're in ventricular fibrillation. This is a heart in ventricular fibrillation. And you can see that it's not beating, it's just shaking. It looks scared almost. But the thing that's so bad about this quivering, this shaking, is that means it's not pumping any blood. The ventricles should be going through this strong contraction to pump blood into the arteries. But if they're just shaking like this, they're pumping zero blood. What they're going to do now here in a second is defibrillate. You've probably seen those automatic defibrillators throughout campus and at hospitals and all over the place. And basically what they're going to do is shock the muscle at once, basically. Try to depolarize all the cells in the heart so that hopefully once they've shocked them all at the same time, the SA node will take over again. So let's see what happens when they shock. So ventricular fibrillation, bunch of pacemakers. Then they shock the heart, and the SA node takes over again, and now you can see the heart and ventricles beating normally again. So again, VFib, lots of pacemakers, uncoordinated contraction. You defibrillate or shock the heart, and the SA node thankfully takes over again, and now the normal sequence and normal contraction happens again. And then if we show the ECG after it had been shocked, and once the contraction looks normal again, now we see our normal rhythm, where the SA node, our general, has taken over again. So this one is probably the worst one that we'll look at, where the ventricles are not contracting. And if your ventricles don't contract, your brain doesn't get blood, your tissues don't get blood, the heart itself doesn't get blood, and this is life-threatening. Okay, so the things we've seen so far is the general misbehaving, too fast, too slow, ectopic pacemakers being generated, maybe this one going too fast, or a bunch of them in the atria, or a bunch of them in the ventricles. The final class that we're going to look at is where the atria and the ventricles have effectively broken up. They're not in a relationship anymore. And this is a class of arrhythmias known as AV node blocks. So let's look at what AV node blocks are. So what should normally happen, as we said, is that the SA node should fire and stimulate the atria to depolarize. But then this little guy right here, the AV node, his job is to connect what happens up here to what happens down here. So he's kind of serving like the matchmaker between what happens in the atria and what happens in the ventricles. The AV node is the only point that the signal from up here can get down to the ventricles. So now what we're going to see is what happens when the AV node starts malfunctioning, where it's harder for this to talk to the ventricles. So let's see. What we're going to look at first is what's known as a first degree AV node block. And effectively what's happening here is that the AV node is not allowing the signal to get to the ventricles as easily. And so what that means is that the signal, once it gets through the atria, it takes much longer to get through the AV node before it finally gets to the ventricles. Atria depolarize, it takes a longer than normal time for it to get to the ventricles. But what you'll notice is that the atria and the ventricles are kind of still in a relationship. Anytime the atria talks, the ventricles always listen. They're always still working together. It's just, it takes a little bit longer for them to communicate with one another. Says something, takes longer, but it still gets there. So it's kind of like if they're in a relationship, the P wave like says something, and it has to wait longer than normal, and eventually the QRS complex or the ventricles are like, yeah, whatever. They always respond. But the relationship's starting to get a little rocky. Now let's make the relationship a little bit even more rocky. Second degree AV node block, it means that the AV node is now more damaged, or it's not spreading the signal as well. And what you'll notice happens sometimes is you'll get a P wave, but the QRS doesn't follow. The signal doesn't spread into the ventricles. So the atria and ventricles are still in a relationship. You'll notice that sometimes they're talking with one another. P wave, QRS, P wave, QRS, P wave, QRS. But sometimes there are certain days, certain moments, when the P wave talks, but the QRS just says, no, I'm not listening. So the relationship is getting a little bit worse. It's taking longer for the signal to spread through the AV node, and sometimes it takes so long that the QRS or the ventricles never get the signal. So the way I think about this is a relationship that's having some maybe bigger issues, where sometimes, some days, everything's great, P wave, QRS, P wave, QRS, but some days the P wave tries to say something and the QRS says, nah, you know what you did, and it just doesn't respond. But that never happened in first degree. The QRS always listened to the P wave, And now we're getting sometimes where the QRS says it's fed up. It doesn't listen to the P wave anymore. And this is caused by the fact that the AV node is not allowing the signal to get from the atria to the ventricles. All right, so now let's take it up a notch. Now let's go to third degree AV node block. And what this means is that the AV node is now completely 100% blocked. Any signal that happens in the atria cannot spread into the ventricles. What this means then is that the atria and the ventricles are each going to be at their own rhythm, independent of one another. They're not talking to each other at all. So in third degree block, this little guy is completely stopping the signal. So what's happening up here is completely independent from what's happening up here. They're not connected at all. And what's weird about this third degree block is it kind of looks sort of normal, even though it's the most severe block. So let's talk about how you can identify third degree block. And the key to identifying third degree block is you got to find that the ventricles and the atria are each beating at their own rhythm, independent of one another. So let's try that. To identify third degree block, let's first try to identify all the QRS complexes. And those are pretty easy. You can see these huge spikes. And if we mark them, you can see that they're occurring at a normal rhythm. Like this one is occurring, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes later, this one occurs. 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes later. 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes later. The QRS complex is occurring at a normal rhythm. But if I look at the P waves, those are occurring at a very different rhythm. You can see that they're occurring at their own rhythm too. So P wave here, like 1.5 boxes later, another P wave. 1.5 boxes later, another P wave. The P wave is actually hidden right there. 1.5 boxes, another P wave. 1.5 boxes, another P wave. 1.5 boxes, another P wave. So the P waves are occurring at their own rhythm, and this rhythm is completely independent of the QRS. So the P wave and the QRS complexes are occurring independently, which means that the atria and the ventricles are living independent lives. They are not connected or talking to each other anymore. So they are completely broken up, completely separated. So this is the way to identify third degree. When you see that the QRS are occurring at a normal rhythm, the P waves are occurring at a normal rhythm, but those rhythms are completely independent. So now what we're going to do, if you want to, is I've posted a series of 6, 7, or 8 ECGs to practice identifying the ones that we just went through in this video. So before lab, you can go through those ECGs, diagnose them, and bring them to lab. And if they all look good and you can explain them, I will say peace out. Or your instructor will say peace out. But if you can't, I will be there, and your instructor will be there to help you through how to diagnose those ECGs. In the meantime, as always, if there are any questions, let me know. And hope you guys have a great rest of your day or your night.